Look, man, she goes through enough in 32 weeks. Enough. Too many peaks, too many valleys, too many highs, too many lows. It's 32 weeks. It couldn't have been a week longer because I don't think this girl could have taken it. Howdy, I'm Jeff Goldsmith, and this is the Q&A. My agenda is simple. Each week, I plan to bring you in-depth insights into the creative process of storytelling. Folks, I'm very happy to have with me today writer-director Brian Cavallaro to discuss his latest film, 32 Weeks. You know, it was cool to talk to Brian because we really got into not just the movie itself and the writing and directing of it, but also some of the interesting things he did to make this movie on a micro-budget scale at certain points. And that's something that I think is inspiring to everybody because it shows that if you have an idea that you're committed to, if you have a movie that you want to make, you could go make it. There's not a lot of things that are stopping you if you could get the basic funds together to get a skeleton crew, use prosumer equipment, and get the job done. And that's what Brian did. So it was cool to talk about that element, especially along with the other things that we talked about as well, including his creative process. But that was cool. And I was glad that Brian was able to share that with us. So there's a lot of good stuff in here, folks. And I know you'll dig this episode. And speaking of things to dig, I hope you check out Backstory Magazine. You know, we always have a holiday issue, and this year is no different. Issue 42 has now become our holiday issue, and we're releasing it like within a week. And it's awesome. I'm really proud of it. I'm proud of my team. The fine folks at Backstory have all pitched in to make this thing come to life, and there's really cool stuff in there, and I'm going to be talking about it later in other episodes to tease it. The only thing I'll tell you is we have everything from exclusive unproduced screenplays by writers that we love who are writers of note, and the only place in the world you can read them is Backstory. We have interviews with all the filmmakers that you would come to expect from us, comic book writers, even a novelist. Like, we have a lot of great interviews. So this is an awesome quarantine read that I'm really proud of, and we can't do it without your support. So, you know, you could give the gift of Backstory. You could gift a subscription to somebody if you are already a subscriber, and I hope you are. And you could do that at backstory.net, and you could use code SAVE5. That's save in the number 5, and that'll save you $5 off a 1-year subscription, and it'll give you access to our archive, which now is going back to issue 30, and I'm working on issue 29 to get it in there, and we're going to keep adding new older issues because we're going to have more time. But look, we can't do it without you. So especially my podcast listeners, if you've never read Backstory, we have a free issue that you can read right now over at backstory.net on a desktop or laptop, or in our iPad app, Backstory. You could read our free issue. You could test drive us. If you subscribe on the website, your login credentials will work in the iPad app as well. So there's my pitch, kids. We can't do it without you, and your support would be greatly appreciated. But, you know, while you're supporting things online, I hope you also go see 32 Weeks, because you'll be supporting an independent filmmaker, namely today's guest. I think such things should be rewarded. So I hope you do go check out 32 Weeks as well while you're surfing around online. But now, without any further ado, let's jump right into our conversation with writer-director Brian Cavallaro to discuss his latest film, 32 Weeks. All right. So Brian, good to have you, man. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, you know, I want to give everybody a baseline. So tell me about your past. From whence dost thou hail? Did you go to film school? What got you into filmmaking?
I did. I went to theater school. I have an undergraduate degree in theater.
I have a theater degree laying around as well. Where'd you go?
Look at that. University of Central Florida.
Okay. All right, cool.
And, yeah, it was a great experience. And I think there I learned that it would be, you know, fun to direct. And at that point, I felt like directing film was probably a better, you know, move than directing theater, you know, and just in terms of like where we're, you know, because we're in the 20th century now, you know. And so I went to University of Miami for grad school to study film there. And that's where I really started to understand, you know, what directing film was.
Well, so did you direct any theater while you were in school?
I did a little bit. Yeah, I was really like,
come on, tell us.
So I was a Llewellyn Laverty Overlander was something that I did. Like I was an assistant director on, and, you know, sort of learned under somebody named Lanny Harris. We had a great program with, you know, really good old school theater directors as part of the program.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
What do you think of what's been going on with theater during the pandemic? I've actually been kind of impressed to see how theater has made some technological leaps lately, and people are doing, you know, live shows on Zoom, staged readings on Zoom. I've been searching a lot of that out.
It's interesting. It's cool seeing people like try to adjust. The Geffen Playhouse here in LA is now doing something with A Christmas Carol, where it's like a hybrid of film and theater. And I think that's really the sweet spot, because you're really getting like all the joys of what can happen in live theater with, the cinematography that we all come to expect when we're looking at a screen.
Yeah. I mean, I love it. They call it the Geffen Stay House. So yes,
Cool.
we're going to a show with it later tonight.
Great.
Well, so, one of the what was the most important thing that you think you learned in film school? Being a theater kid, kind of going to that next level, something that was eye-opening for you.
I think it was it was cool to have the opportunity to fail, like in a safe space. So that was probably the best thing to learn. It was a great film school. You had access to everything there while you're there. So just being able to check out equipment all the time, make mistakes, that was really the absolute, best part of it.
That's cool. The most traumatic thing that could happen to a film school kid is graduating. So what'd you do when you graduated? Like, what was the next step for breaking in?
So when I graduated, I was an ambitious film school student. So I made a feeture while I was in film school. That was my thesis film.
That would be in plain sight, I'm guessing.
Yep.
2004. Right.
Yep. So I made that while I was in film school. It was part of the reason I went to the University of Miami was it was one of the few film schools where you could actually own the film when you're done with it. So like if you go to USC, they own the negative and everything. Yep. So you could own the film. Again, I was very ambitious, business minded at the time. I was like, this is great. I'm going to make a movie. I'll own the movie. And, it was not what it is today, but at the time we were able to sell it to Netflix. It was streaming on Netflix. And that was, a big coup, for coming out in, a film school with a feature. So that was kind of like my first, real thing.
Actually, I'm really curious. So you sold it to Netflix, which was then a DVD company, basically.
But it was in 2004. They were streaming. They were kind of up on their feet and they were moving. But yeah, it was a DVD company. And to this day, you could still rent in plain sight through Netflix's DVD program. There's awesome. Not enough room in their bandwidth for 2004 student films anymore, streaming. But you can still get it on DVD there, and it's on Tubi. It's still available.
That's awesome. Well, so what was your biggest lesson on that? Your first feature? I'm sure there were a bunch.
Yeah. Where do we want to start?
Trial by fire.
Yeah, trial by fire. You can only ask so many favors of people, right? I mean, it was just. I mean, I called in the cavalry on that one. So yeah, it's like if you're going to do it, I think that is a good lesson to call in the cavalry. Ask for all the favors you can, but understand that that's going to be it for a second.
What was your deer in headlights moment? Kind of the moment that all the planning couldn't prepare you for, and you really had to kind of rise to the challenge on that.
I think the timeline, because I really wanted to get it done by the time I graduated. And that's a lot to, actually graduate, to do the work you need to do to graduate and finish a thesis film. And to begin with, the school was only a 2-year program at that time to begin with. So it was a little bit of a hustle to try to get it done, and graduate on time. But to me, I was like, as much as I cared about the film, I wanted to, move to LA and start my career and say, this is my film and I'm done with it, and then move on to the next thing.
Well, so that's great. So, I mean, like, you got your first film in the can, but, like, you're still going through the industry. I know that in 2007, you were an office PA on Gary Marshall's Georgia Rule. And,
yep.
He's a great director and legendary guy. What was it like for you to be on a big set like that?
My best Gary Marshall moment was with him. I was in an elevator with him, just the two of us, and it was taking a while. And, he was nice. He introduced himself to me prior to this, and we knew each other and had Bob in the hallways. But the elevator was taking a while, and he said that he could write a sitcom by the time the elevator gets to the bottom floor. So
yes, and he probably could have.
He probably could, yeah.
He probably could have had it sold as well. But 2007, it's interesting because you're PAing on that film. And, just before we move on, what was the thing that surprised you the most about being on a big set like that? Something that you were, even though you knew what it was going to be, you were like, oh, wow, that's how they're doing that.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I think, just seeing the infrastructure of how everything worked and how quickly, I mean, you always see, and, being interested in film, you're always watching like DVD commentaries and behind the scenes of how things work. But I think once you get in the nitty gritty and you're there, you read the script on the first day, you understand where it all is laid out, but then you start putting the pieces of the puzzle together, right? The script says that, there's big parts of it take place in Idaho. And then, you're looking at other paperwork and you're shooting out in the valley. Right. And, there's a little naive part of you that's like, when are we going to Idaho? But then, you go to set and you're like, this looks like Idaho. They did a great job of making this look like Idaho. So that was like a really cool aha seeing it, for the first time.
That's cool. Well, I mean, what I love about, you being a PA in 2007 is you also co-directed the Unknown trilogy in 2007 as well. So it's like you were serving your time, but you were also still on your path as a director. What was your biggest lesson for the Unknown trilogy?
So that came about this. So this is how calling in the cavalry, I think, is great advice, right? So in plain sight, it was shot on HD, which sounds silly now, but at the time that was a big deal, right? In 2004, shooting a student film. I think we claimed it was the first student film shot on HD, and I think that stands, feature length. So I had a friend in high school, Jen Macariello. Her father was a DP in Philly, like in the area where I grew up. His name's Joe Macariello. I called her and said, what can I do to get your dad to come here with his big fancy HD camera that he owns? And for whatever reason, he agreed to do it. So not only did that make my student film, look a lot better because I had a real professional shooting it, but while I was in film school, he hired me to come back to Philly to shoot a commercial, which was great. That commercial, won an Emmy, which was, amazing. So I ended up walking out of film school with an Emmy, and then a regional Emmy.
What commercial was it?
Regional Emmy. It was for like a local. It was for a Philadelphia news station. So they give out regional Emmys for things like that. So he was like a regional DP, which is cool. And then when Unknown Trilogy was going, the producers brought him onto the project. There were other directors attached to the project, and he had recommended me for that job as well because he enjoyed working with me. So that's why it's great to call him the cavalry, because you never know who can turn around and help you out again there.
Well, so then from there, and we will get to today's film, of course, but you kind of progressed into television, and you leaned into it pretty hard, and it's a great way to cut your teeth as a director and as a writer. What were some of the lessons that kind of grew on you and helped shape your creative habit as you went up through the ranks in television?
I think, first of all, realizing how much unscripted television requires writing, there's really so much that goes into that, and you really understand docuseries are run like documentaries and how much writing goes into a documentary. You start to understand structure a lot better. All that was really helpful. And then I had an opportunity to work on a show called Next Stop for Charlie, which was on Showtime for 2 seasons. It was the tiniest crew you could possibly imagine. And so I got a full writer credit on it because everybody was wearing every hat. And so I was like, okay, I can come in and help, write on this, sure. But by the time it's over, you really feel like you've learned a lot about how to, structure something, how to arc over the course of an episode and over the course of a whole season.
That's awesome. That sounds like a great experience. And then in 2017, you directed Against the Night. And so, that's kind of bringing us to your feature before 32 weeks. What was the biggest lesson on Against the Night, and what was your budget and schedule?
So in between here and there, I had the opportunity, was asked to write a lot of stuff, a lot of screenplays. I did a couple adaptations, a bunch of things that just never show up on anybody's resume. And that process got extremely frustrating. And so I was like, I want to just start where I went with.
Sorry to interrupt. Was it like ghostwriting, or was it like just there were things that were never made?
Things that never got made. I did a couple projects for like Mandalay that just sitting on a shelf, somebody's shelf still. Some things that
development hell.
Correct. Yeah. Or an adaptation of a book. And then, the movie's out now, but not my adaptation of that book. Right. Somebody else did it and it was fine. So yeah, just a lot of development hell. So got, not frustrating is a strong word, but, got to the point where I was like, okay, I made in plain sight in film school with very little resources. I can do this again, especially with what I've learned from how to get things done in sort of a TV space, and certainly from Next Stop for Charlie about how to get, really tell a story. Equipment had come a long, long, long way. So being able to have those resources and understanding of how to do it. I'm from the Philadelphia area. There's a prison there called Eastern State Penitentiary. I ended up shooting in an adjacent prison called Holmesburg, which I recently found out when I was scouting is even better and scarier and more accessible to film in. And so as a kid, I went to Eastern State Penitentiary and didn't understand why there weren't more movies that were filmed there. So I always thought about trying to film something there. And so I said, okay, I'm going to actually go do this myself. So I essentially just did it myself. So, the budget is, whatever I could scrape up, right? It was a credit card kind of budget, but it was a great experience and kind of got me back into, what I was really enjoying doing about filmmaking. And
did you get your money back? Did you sell it okay?
There's always nightmare stories, right. But I can say that the distribution deal that it got a 10-screen theatrical across the country, which is 10 times what I expected.
Oh yeah.
I expected 0 theater. I was very practical about what would come of this, but it being distributed in 10 theaters was, tremendous. It was very bumpy to get to this point, but I'm at a point now where I'm starting to actually see, some returns on it.
That's
and,
great.
felt confident enough to, do it again.
That's great. Well, let's get to today's film, 32 Weeks. When did you first get the idea for it?
So after Against the Night, I enjoyed, the horror genre. And I was like, well, I'd like to do this again. There were challenges, and, I live in LA now. And even though like I love Philly, there were challenges in flying there and filming in Philly. So I was like, all right, I live in LA. There's plenty of great resources here. So what can I do here? And there were this was at a time where there's a lot of really interesting stories about catfishing. There's always interesting stories about, or unfortunate stories about sex trafficking. And so I thought there's probably a story that could involve these things. And so I started writing with the auspices of this could be like a horror film that involves these things. And so I just sort of did a normal setup, right? Like where it's maybe not such a horror film in the first act. And, 90 pages later, I had written a romantic comedy. So it's kind of like, I just sort of got into a groove of something. So it started with one certain idea and then really just kind of took off. And then once I had really a rough idea of what it was, and I started paring it down into, the movie it is now.
Did you ever consider just not like just keeping it as like a rom-com rather than going into like the thriller aspect?
Of course, yeah. So I think the only reason I pulled away from that was because I was hesitant. There is an amnesia element to all of this.
Right.
And
that's in the trailer.
And I'm nervous. I was nervous about that to begin with. I think before I put one word down on paper, I was like, am I really about to start a thing about amnesia, right? Like it's just been done so much and so often. So I was very nervous about that. And then even more nervous about doing just a straight romantic comedy about amnesia. I was like, all right, I think I have to finish this the way I intended to start it, but just in an indie way, in a way that you couldn't do in a studio movie.
When you have somebody that's your protagonist who's suffering from amnesia, and, in this case, it was a car wreck, it also, in a sense, creates an unreliable narrator, which keeps that character and the audience kind of on edge of what's true and what isn't. What were the challenges that you found writing a character like that?
So the thing that was interesting for me was like that stuff kind of came easy because I think for me, like what some of the themes were for this was just like trust and a lack of trust that you see that happens within relationships. So like even I think like on a macro level, something we all like, hopefully in the big picture, we don't experience a lot of what has happened in the movie, right?
Right.
But on a smaller scale, like what happened in the record store in the middle of the movie is basically the whole movie on a larger scale, right? So it's like you're on a date and people lie to each other. They tell each other little white lies on a date, on the very first date, just to kind of get to the second date. Right.
Just for anybody that hasn't seen it, it's interesting. She's going with the guy that she had been dating, and he's, she's returning to places, some familiar, some new. And, she says that she thinks she's been there before, and, says that, she doesn't have to tell him, but she thinks it was with a different guy. And they talk about, the concept of, isn't when you date somebody little white lies. Like if you didn't have amnesia, would you have told me that you were actually on a date here before? Is that the right thing to do? And, he admits that he was there on a date before as well. So it was an interesting scene, kind of getting out of the story, but kind of getting back to the fundamentals of what the story are about.
Yeah, it's an unreliable narrator that you're talking about. So it's like almost on every little first date, there's a little bit of an unreliable narrator. You're there to get to know each other, but more often than not, there's little white lies that come along the way with it.
Tell us about your creative habit. When you sit down to write, how important is outlining to your process?
I'm a big note taker on my phone. So I think I'll take long walks and think and jot things down on my phone.
What do you use? What program?
It's just the notes app on an iPhone. Cool. Yeah. And then I will email that to myself, copy and paste it in the final draft, and then use that to start outlines. Use that as the outline. And then all little thoughts and processes that I'll just have at the bottom of the script or the last page and just kind of go back and keep reading it as I'm writing to just remind myself of, what the intent was.
I think Apple Notes is very reliable, but I will throw in one app in case you want to expand. There was an app called Wunderlist, and they got bought by Microsoft, and they turned it into what's now called Microsoft To Do.
Oh,
so
cool.
At first glance, it's a to-do list, but if you have a category called 32 weeks, all the subcategories underneath it would then be separate notes, and you could slide them around in order And like, it's just a great place to organize just everything, ranging from a grocery list to even an outline. So I highly recommend it, only because the thing you said about having to email yourself, I mean, notes will sync to your cloud and to your phone. To do is the same thing. So if you enter something on your phone, by the time you're back at your laptop, it's actually already there. So just throwing that out. Don't worry, I don't work for Microsoft, but it's
that sounds really helpful.
It's something that has really helped me organize, but it's actually great for writing stuff too. And I use it for the magazine just to track articles, because then you could, like, inside of like, your record shop scene, you could take a million notes that are just in the record shop scene. So, it's a good thing. When you sit down to write, how long do you give yourself? Do you give yourself a page count that you want to hit each day, or a certain amount of hours to hit?
I think that there's a page count, and I have to, when I actually start writing it, I have to kind of do it quickly, because I'll start to, I really want to stay in it. Like if I walk away, if I wrote half of something and walk away from it, it's very, very hard for me to come back a month later. So I have to make sure I have the time allocated to actually do it. And knowing that I want to get it done quickly, I really try to hit, even if it's bad, and it usually is, I try to hit like 10 pages a day, so that to say that like within a couple of weeks, then I can say, I have something here. And then I can take a step back, come back, and then, revise it.
Different people have different times for their process, but how long would you say you give yourself to outline before you go to scripting stage? Like, so in the case of 32 weeks, how long did you spend outlining it?
I don't have a set amount. It was less than a month of just sort of like thinking about it and jotting things down. I don't have a set amount of time that makes sense. I think it's just, how things sort of fit into the schedule, and then when I have, a hole that I can say, okay, I can really sit down and block everything else out and really just, bang this thing out in a couple of weeks.
Okay. And so is that what happened? You banged it out in a couple of weeks to get your first rough draft, so that you could then play with it from there?
Yep.
Okay. So under a month. So what do you do if you get writer's block? If you get it, how do you handle that?
I'll either, go on a hike and then, just sort of think through what makes sense, or just watch any other films, because these are all, we're not reinventing the wheel, so I'll look at other films and maybe say, more often than not, look at what they did and make sure I don't do that, to say, okay, well, this is something that has been done, but what worked about it, and then how can I make it work and get to this part of it without, falling into a trope.
Were you going into films that kind of have amnesia as a subject? Were there any films that like were good reference for you?
I've certainly made sure I watched a few that I wouldn't normally have, especially like in the romantic comedy genre, to make sure I wasn't tripping over myself. I honestly, like an Against the Night, the movie came out, and a lot of people were like, this is just like, I mean, I'm going to sound like an idiot now, but they're going to be like, this is just like Grave Encounters. And I was like, great, what's that? So I think I watched a lot more films about amnesia than I normally would have, just to really make sure I wasn't, tripping on other people's work.
Sure. That makes sense. I'm curious, like your directing pre-production habit, because, when you have a small amount of time to shoot, it's important that you're organized so you can maximize your on-set time. What are some of the tips and tricks that you do as a director to prepare for an indie shoot?
For shooting, I'm like an index card fiend. I have index cards everywhere. They're all color coded. They go by day. They're in my back pocket. And I pull them out and go through them, all day long.
Wait, what's on them? Is that like your script breakdown? Is that what you're doing?
It'll have the scene. It'll have like shot list. It's everything. It's all on one note card. It's all scribbly, but it'll have like a little bit of a shot list, a little bit of a storyboard if I need it. But it'll have the number of the scene that we're working on that day. And especially in 32 weeks, there are a bunch of little tiny scenes as well. Especially in like flashbacks, there's little moments in there. So it'll just say like, it'll also even have, I'll be keeping track of, like, on a movie of this size, like I didn't have somebody, keeping an eye on wardrobe or script. So it'll literally just even say like, just a reminder of like what day it is, So it's like, okay, in the story, this is day 7 in the story. These are the intentions. This happened before, this happened after. Just a big reminder note card.
So wait, did you not have a script supervisor?
No, there was a very, very small crew.
Oh, wow. Okay. I mean, that's tough, because you're right. You're jumping around a lot in time, which we'll talk about later for your structure, because I thought that was cool. Actually, you know what? We can talk about it now, because it's really not spoilery. As she's starting to remember things, you just like have this index of weeks, and the numbers keep flipping, from 32 weeks to week 17 or week week 14, in which it's kind of recounting what her life was those 32 weeks before the accident, jumping backwards and forwards in time. At what point did you realize you were going to use that structural mechanism as a way to kind of quickly get back in bursts of small scenes, so you would have a nonlinear thing that you could always jump to?
That's a great question. I'm not sure I know the answer. Like, I don't know if I had intended that when I started or if it just came up. I always knew that I would use music as a trigger for flashbacks for her memory. I really like movies where there's a question and the answer is the title, right? And so like I knew I wanted to do early on in the movie, right? So they ask how long has she known Josh? The answer is 32 weeks. That's the title card. And then I knew I wanted to flashback to week 1 to tell a little bit more of the story. But I think writing that and learning from that process made me really want to do that for both of sort of the men in her life. So that happens in the beginning with the first boy and at the end with the second one.
Did you have any rehearsal time?
Yeah. So Cole, the lead of the film, lives in Philadelphia. She flew out. She stayed at an Airbnb here, and we spent a lot of time hanging out and talking and, working through how things were going to be. And then, on the set that day, people would, whoever's in the scene that day, we would just sort of walk through it and then talk about what makes sense. And it was not a lot of rehearsal time. It wasn't like weeks of everybody sitting around a table together. It was just, on the day, but we made sure we made time for it.
Okay. So it wasn't before the film shot.
No, nothing formal.
I mean, that just because you have a theater degree and you have the theater background as well, that's the thing that I found sometimes the strangest about film is that there are some productions that really do rehearse. And I always see rehearsal as a good thing, but there's a lot of filmmakers and actors that have been on the stage as well, strangely, who insist that they'd rather, quote unquote, discover it on set, which I think is a risky proposition sometimes, because you are often limited with your time on set. So to me, like I always love the Hitchcockian method a little more, where so much advanced work is done that getting to set, some things are foregone conclusions. But, obviously I'm guessing on your other productions, you didn't really have a lot of time for rehearsal as well, did you?
Certainly not. No, I mean, it really does come down to like, it's a budgetary concern, and you're really,
right.
A lot of the actors worked for, very little or deferred. And so it's like, this is the time that we have, to do it. And so I just worked with them as much as we could. I mean, if I had a month, I would have loved to have, really worked through it and then probably even use the rehearsals to reshape the script. But, it's limitations.
Sure. Shooting in LA is not always the easiest thing to do. I mean, the first question I would ask, did you get a California tax credit?
This movie was so small that they wouldn't even pick up my phone call. I mean, it's like, it's very small, but it's not necessary, like for a movie of this size. And that's true for
It's just crazy because everybody flies around the nation to go to other states, and there's so much runaway production. It's rare that you get a movie that's actually shot in LA these days. And, it's usually because they're tax credit chasing to like other productions.
It's true. Yeah. And it's something that I really wanted to take advantage of. I think that was something I really wanted to try to check off a lot of boxes that would be hard to do otherwise. So if it was a bigger movie, they probably would have forced it out of California, certainly out of Santa Monica. So I was like, all right, I'm going to show as much of Santa Monica as I can and make it like a real LA movie.
Yeah, you really did. So I was going to ask, was everything permitted, or were you kind of stealing locations? I mean, you were shooting at Point Dune on the beach. You were all over, the merry-go-round and the Ferris wheel and everything down like at the end of the pier and definitely on the beach. What was that like to deal with the city to get those kind of permits, if you did?
So there was one scene that had a permit. We'll save that for the spoiler section.
Okay.
The pier, I'm going to say something now that's going to get everybody excited to go shoot at the pier tomorrow.
Yeah.
The pier, as long as you don't have like a big boom pole flying over everybody's heads, and as long as you don't put something on the ground, they don't mind if you film there.
Really? So as long as you don't have camera sticks, you don't have
correct.
Sticks. So if you're handheld, you're good.
Correct.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, it's a risk not being, filming there. And obviously, these are not all extras. So you're kind of dancing around trying to make sure everybody's not looking down the barrel. But otherwise, I mean, it's good production value and, they don't mind. They don't mind if you're there. I was going to
ask that. Did you have to run around getting releases from anybody that was behind the shots, or just was it?
No, it's a sort of a public space, and so it kind of works. So
Okay.
now if somebody's really there, really in the scene, that becomes an issue. But if they're back and they're soft, our lawyers didn't have any problems. So
All right, that's great. That's awesome to hear. You also shot on the Metro.
yes,
What was it like for that? Was that again like a stolen shot? Because I mean, now
that was
you could go.
Those were stolen. Those were little. Yeah, those were just little bits. If there was a bigger scene, I might have tried to permit that. But I've had friends that have filmed have done Metro stuff before. And again, it's like there's good places to do this in California. So in Sacramento, you can shoot on the Metro very cheaply. And a lot of LA things you see that are on the Metro are shot in Sacramento, which again is unfortunate that you're even having to leave this area. But at least you're keeping it in state. Yeah.
But you were able to steal it on there?
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. We're going to talk about production for a second. I think it's important to demyth it if you can, whenever you can, to show that if there's a will, there's a way. So what camera were you shooting on?
We shot with an A7S, which is like prosumer camera. It's like a mirrorless digital Sony camera. We had a Atomos Shogun 4K monitor / recorder, so we record directly to that to get like a nice clean 4K image.
That's cool. And what'd you do for sound?
Sound was, so on the bigger days, we had a sound guy with us, Richard Trejo, who's tremendous at what he does. When we had, multiple people, there's a lot of moving parts. On smaller days, it was just, I had a backpack with a couple of lavaliers in there and a shotgun mic.
That's great. So, I mean, how many people would you say were in your crew on your set on a typical day?
So when we had bigger days, like we had a hospital set, we had, there's a car crash sequence. So when there's multiple people in the room talking, if there's a party sequence, we would have, our producer would be on set with us, Ariel Breckfeld, who's amazing at what she does. And she's kind of wears a bunch of hats. And then we had our DP, Will Barrett, and then like an AE Gaffer Swing and Richard on sound. And that was it on the bigger days. And then on the smaller days, it was just me. So it was just two actors. It would just be me with a couple lavaliers in the backpack. And it was really the best way to like kind of move nimbly around Santa Monica and get, all the great shots that you want to get.
No, that's awesome. And it looked fantastic. So, I mean, like, the things that you could get away with a small crew these days are pretty incredible, which is just great for independent filmmakers. Did the guilds help you? Did they give you any sort of relaxed rates? I know that there's independent waivers for a lot of the guilds. So what were they able to do for you?
So this is completely non-union. All the actors are non-union actually as well.
Oh,
so
interesting. Okay.
So which is, it's an interesting challenge when you look at it from the outside to say like, I want to cast non-union actors, but there are great non-union actors out there, so knowing that getting SAG involved would add an extra layer of, complexity to it. I wanted to, cast all non-union. The other guilds, I'm not in the Writers Guild, so it wasn't a big deal. The Directors Guild has not come to bother me yet so far. So I think, it was really a non-union film.
No, that's cool. I just know that there's guild waivers and stuff like that. What were some of the amusing tips and tricks you had to pull? Like, even like at your locations, like the record store, for instance.
The record store is the perfect example of a kind of how I would sort of get a location locked down. So if you ask, too much, for permission too far in advance, they're likely to say no. There's too many people get involved. So what I would do with the actors was I would tell them, okay, today we're going to shoot record store day. And the plan was that I had a bunch of record stores out on the map. And I was like, all right, we're going to stop at these record stores and we're going to try and film in each one and see who will, bite. And, the Record Surplus in Santa Monica was my first choice, obviously. Went in, talked to the lovely gentleman behind the counter and asked him if he could turn the music down for an hour if I gave him, $100. And that's it. That became our location. And he became a part of the scene and got him to sign a waiver, and here we are. Now it's in the film.
That's awesome. And did you also have like a location release waiver signed as well by him, or was he not authorized to do something like that?
What's interesting about location releases? I have worked on small movies and I've worked on big movies, and they don't seem to matter as much as all the other releases.
Interesting.
People were very interested in the idea of like it's kind of like once you're out of there and the building is not caught on fire, it's over. Right. So as long as there's no damage was done, then you're in pretty good shape.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's almost like it's almost more important before you film there, than actually after.
Well, right, for insurance purposes as well.
Right.
Were there any other tips you want to share with us? There were handy things that you did or learned on a shoot like that?
I mean, it's good. I was lucky shooting this, the Showtime show. I was able to, again, it was a very, very small crew, and I was able to learn everything on that. So yeah, I mean, if the tip is to say that, it's helpful to learn, how to shoot something yourself and to run audio yourself, then that really goes a long way, because I think being nimble is really great. And I think it really helps the actors and puts them at ease too. They completely understood what they were getting into before we got into it. But yeah, there's an intimacy of just being, you're the only person in the room with them, or even just out on the pier with them or the record store with them. They can, I think it makes them feel more natural. It doesn't feel like there's a whole big crew surrounding them and
Right.
they're, on a stage.
Well, that's the fascinating thing, is that all the equipment has gotten smaller and more mobile, obviously. So you really can, do your own thing if you put it in a little bit of planning and you have the right equipment, and more importantly, the right people that know how to operate the equipment as well. So that's important too.
It's amazing how much the technology is catching up, and I'm hopeful to see more and more films, made this way, and that way you get to see more and more interesting things shot in more and more interesting places in different countries, and maybe even poorer communities, and seeing their stories. I mean, it's all part and parcel. So that's
Cool.
what comes out of it. Then great.
Yeah, that makes sense. Ooh, hey, I'm jumping in really quick to remind you to check out Backstory Magazine. You can find us over at backstory.net. We could be read on a desktop or laptop, or of course through our iPad app, Backstory, as well. And folks, we are putting out our holiday issue, which is our issue 42, our long delayed quarantine issue. It is packed with so much material because we've just kept adding to it this whole time. And I wasn't sure when we were going to release it, but now I know the time is right. And it's got so much cool material that the only place in the world you could even see some of it is inside of Backstory Magazine. I'm really proud of it. So, give us a test run if you've never read us. You could read the free issue over at backstory.net, or you could read the free issue in our iPad app, Backstory. And I hope that inspires you to become a subscriber. And if you want to subscribe, you could use code SAVE5 to save $5 off a subscription. And since it's the holidays, you could even give a gift subscription to the storyteller you love in your life. They'll know it came from you, and it'll give them access not only to our newest issue, which is coming out soon, but also our archive, which goes back about a year and a half, almost 2 years. And we're going to continue adding some of our older issues to it as well as we continue to build our archive. But right now you've got at least 2 years, year and a half, 2 years worth in there. So look, there's a lot of reasons to subscribe to Backstory. Getting support from my podcast listeners on my passion project really means a lot to me. So thanks for considering. And while you're surfing around online, I also hope you support independent filmmaking and go see 32 Weeks, today's film that we were talking about right here. That would mean a lot to Brian and, of course, his cast and his crew. So spread the word and go see 32 Weeks. And now, without any further ado, let's jump right back into our conversation with writer-director Brian Cavallaro about his latest film, 32 Weeks. Well, so, okay, what was your budget and schedule, if you're able to say?
Okay. Of course. I mean, I have nobody to answer to on this. The budget was the price of a used car, not even a new car.
Okay.
Just a used car. And the schedule, we shot it in like 17 days.
Okay.
So I took a little bit of time for what it was, but there's so many little bits, right? Like we're at the Venice Pier for a little bit. We're on the Metro for a little bit. We're in front of the Aero Theater for a little bit. So it was just about moving to all these different places. Was trying to be very respectful of the actors' schedules, because again, this was not like a big priority project, for them. So if they booked a commercial or something in advance, I would try to work around that. So altogether it was, 17.
That's great to have those days. Was it 17 consecutive, or was it kind of start and stop?
It was mostly consecutive. There's maybe a day or two off.
That's great. That's great. Well, so, all right, we're going to get into the spoilers now, because I want to discuss the fine details here. So if you have not yet seen 32 Weeks, press pause, go rent it, come back, and join us for the rest of the conversation. You could find it basically anywhere online where you would get VOD, or where you would rent a movie, correct? Is there anywhere else that I should highlight it?
That's it.
Okay. Yeah. You could find it in all the regular places. All right. Spoilers, you've been warned. So, starting kind of slow, what kind of research did you do on Amnesia, specifically somebody that was the victim of a car wreck, and what their short-term and long-term memory loss would be? What did you learn through that experience, and how did it inform your story?
So I have a friend who's a nurse. Her name is Fran. She was very helpful in terms of giving me advice as to specifically, I was very interested in, because amnesia can be so vague, especially in storytelling, and people are really willing to accept anything.
for the sake of a story with amnesia. And for the most part, really anything is possible with amnesia. It's perfectly normal to have amnesia for 32 weeks. From a spoiler standpoint, I was more interested in what would happen, if you took ketamine or if you were given ketamine, and what would happen in a hospital setting, right? Like how would they test for it? Would they call you? Like the things you see in the movie, right? Like what would happen? And everything lined up the way that it does in the movie. So that's all very logical that could have happened the way it happened in the movie.
That makes sense. I mean, I guess the only other question I would ask is what did you learn about like how memories come back? Because the ketamine, which, the date rape drug, which we'll get to a little later, that's not really what's causing the amnesia, though. It's the fact that she had the blunt force trauma of the car wreck.
Right. Yeah. So anything can trigger memories. People are now, and I was very fascinated in this, that it does make sense to say, like what the doctor says, what the neurologist says, to say, why don't you look through, your Facebook page, right? Like I've never seen that in a movie before, and it makes a ton of sense, and it is real, and it does happen, right? Like that's where you would go. Do you see familiar faces? Do you see familiar names? This is your life. Your life is found on your Facebook page or whatever social media platforms you have. And so, yeah, they do that now.
And what'd you find out about music as a mechanism for memory recall? Because it was interesting because that's what she was kind of using. She was a violin teacher. She's learning to play again, and just listening to music is like triggering memories. Is that something that you found as like a part of rehabilitation?
Yeah, and you see that a lot too with Alzheimer's patients. That will help bring back their, you see, and especially if it's very ingrained in who they are. If they're a violin player, or a violin teacher, or a ballerina, you'll see, and you can see clips online of people listening to, music that they had danced to when they were younger, and you see them come back to life. It really helps trigger for them.
So in a film like this, you have an antagonist that's unseen for so much of the movie, in which it's her memory loss that's working against her. But here you actually end up with Warren kind of coming in as the boyfriend she doesn't remember, because, we see Simon for a lot, and he's just kind of trickling into her memories. And then she's warned by her friend Hannah that Warren is not a good guy. They had a bad breakup, and it starts making you wonder, just the way she's wondering what happened. And, he won't tell her. Talk about kind of the introduction of Warren, and then how you decided to use him ultimately as a red herring.
Well, Warren to me is like, there's a lot of this story that's like fantastical and it's living in a movie world, and some of it just is so practical, right? And I think that like Warren's relationship with Cole and Hannah's relationship to them, I think is a very normal thing that people can relate to, right? Where it's just, they had a relationship. It wasn't perfect. The best friend didn't like that it wasn't perfect, but it was probably pretty good. And they're very young. So maybe it was good enough. Maybe they didn't know what they had. Maybe take a little time apart, and maybe it was a perfect relationship. And Hannah's outside influence in this is not helping, right? And especially not helping when you have amnesia, right? So it's like she's trying to repaint what she knew of that relationship. So that in itself is sort of an easy way to work in a red herring, right? So it's just kind of like, yeah, we think of this ex-boyfriend as being bad, and he's not so bad.
Well, right, because the worst thing that Hannah says about him is that basically, he cheated on her, and that's why it ended up so bad. But then the idea that he was also a stalker actually comes from Simon, and is again unreliable narrator territory, because it's a piece of misinformation. So
right.
At what point did you essentially figure out your ending, that Simon's actually a bad guy, and part of his way of hiding his tracks was to make Warren out to be the bad guy that she needed to steer clear of?
Well, I think that part of it was always there from the beginning, in terms of like, the research going into like what is possible for sex trafficking, right? Like in a crazy movie way, right? Where it's just kind of like, you see this in, Taken, right? Where it's like, there's a good guy that is trying to lure in a girl, and it was like a sex trafficking. So this is just sort of like a little bit of a longer play idea. And then once I started to really develop their characters, is when I realized that like this can happen, this could happen in an incidental way, or a mistaken way, where you're trying to cover tracks up. And that became much more interesting to me.
And so at what point did you come up with this ending? I mean, like, we gotta get into it now, in which essentially Simon, tell me if I got it right, Simon, out of frustration that he wasn't able to hook up with her fully, dopes her with ketamine, and rapes her. So he's using the date rape drug. And then rather than let her sleep it off and wake up, he puts her in the passenger seat of a car, drives the car head on into a car wreck, and basically is banking that she'll have amnesia from it, because he then switches her into the driver's side and abandons the scene. When did that very complicated idea occur? And was that the first way that you were accounting for her amnesia?
It was, yeah. So I was very interested in that. There was a whole scene in the beginning at the party where they get to know each other that was all sort of like laid out in the party that I found much more interesting to cut out. Exactly like how they got home. There was more of like you really meet Simon in this party, and like there's just a whole bunch of first act stuff that like I didn't feel like we needed to get to where we were going. And I just wanted to like, to put him in the worst case scenario of he's using this drug, which is horrible, right? But then now you put yourself, now that she's not in the story at this point, she's knocked out, putting yourself into his position of panic, right? Of like, does she sleep it off? Does he think that she's dead? He's really, he's thinking the worst case scenarios, and how does he get out of it?
But was there ever a way that he could just let her sleep it off, or did he think that would be too implicating?
Well, he does like check her pulse, and he thinks she's gone. And so he's like, all right, if I fake like a car accident, then hopefully they just find the body, call it a day.
Well, I mean, there's definitely something off about him. You could tell the whole time. So it is fascinating. Do you think he's done this before? I mean, what do you think led that character to that decision?
It's interesting. Like so the first version of the screenplay, he was the kind of character that had done this before. And then once I did, the 90-page romantic comedy draft, I was like, okay, this is just a guy who really got in way over his head. Right. But listen, anybody that has ketamine laying around the house and, had this clear intention of like, if she's not, if we don't consummate tonight, then I have this backup plan, is just simply not a good human, So whether this was his first time, he would have done it again,
Well, it's interesting because he's really trying hard. If you think about the movie, after he reconnects with her, after she wakes up with amnesia, thinking that he has a second chance, and he's cleared out the concept of Warren so that he's not competing with her ex-boyfriend. So it's interesting that he kind of vilifies him as a stalker when he's really not a stalker.
I think everything he was trying to do was to continue to cover his tracks, to make sure that she didn't remember anything else. And as her memories are coming back, I think he's trying to like put them into certain categories and to place them and say, Warren's not some guy you couldn't get over. Warren's a stalker, right? To help just protect him, like legally, among other things.
What was the romantic comedy version of this? So like, what was that ending? Was it just that like she gets amnesia, seemingly nice guy Simon is there to woo her away. He's always polite, always nice, says he's going to take things slow. And then in the end, she decides she wants to get back with the ex-boyfriend, or tell us about that version. Cause it's just interesting to consider.
Well, I can't say the 90-page version of the romantic comedy was complete. It would say that was the first 90 pages. And I was like, where is this going? How am I going to end this? But there was something that I even shot that you see Warren at the end. Like Warren's at the end and they're getting along and it's great. That just didn't make the cut of the movie. It probably shouldn't have been in the screenplay at all. It's just something that like I didn't want
like they
to
reconnect after the police come for Simon? No.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Look, this is your face is why it's not in the movie.
No, I mean, that was a good decision.
It was actually, I never shot that. I shot a scene where her and Hannah have reconnected, and you just know that everything's going to be okay, right? Like the title card flips from 32 weeks to 33 weeks. There was a script version where Warren shows up with flowers and things like that, Okay. But it's like, I have a very small little trusted crew of people that I send stuff out to, and they very quickly told me that was terrible, and it hit the chopping block pretty quick.
You go through a definite tone shift, in that final scene where she realizes that Simon's been lying to her, also because she finally has, the phone call comes where the doctor tells her that the toxicity in her system was ketamine. Then she starts having the flashback of that night, and you realize she's in the passenger seat. Earlier, when we had seen flashbacks of her from that night, I'm like, oh no, is this a production error? Because she does not seem to be in the driver's seat. Like I noticed that once or twice earlier, but then it's like, oh, she's definitely in the passenger seat on purpose. Okay, so you get over all that. with you know, the crime that Simon commits, but then you take it a step further, and like this romantic comedy like Amnesia movie becomes like, you know, I am the hunter and you are the hunted, like suddenly in Simon's apartment. Like what were the variants that you played with the endings there? I mean, it's good that, like, you know, she offs the guy because he's a scumbag, but I mean, like, was there ever a version where she didn't kill him, where he isn't lunging at her and she has a knife? What were some of the other variants you played with for your ending?
The only other versions were it just ending incrementally earlier than that, right? And that's something I even thought about and played in with the edits, right? So like think like, you know, Paul Schrader, First Reformed, right, where it just kind of ends and then everything is left to your imagination, right? You finish the rest of the story in the proverbial parking lot on the way out. So there was never going to be a happy ending version of this. I wanted to make an indie film, right? Like I wanted to do something that you couldn't do inside of the box. So I always knew that I wanted it to end like this. But if you ended it a little bit shorter, it was the idea of like, now, you know, what would you do if you were her? You have this opportunity now. Like, what would you do in this situation? Do you call the police? Do you go for a knife? What do you do? But I wanted to ultimately decide to give the audience a little bit, and it's already happens pretty quickly, and there's some ambiguity already. I thought that was enough, right? Enough vague storytelling.
One of the things I forgot to talk about earlier during production is you have a lot of sunset shots. Was that a difficulty for you to pull off? Because I know the minute you're trying to do a sunset shot with dialogue, you're running into racing the sun, you know, and losing your light. So obviously I'm guessing you were shooting one camera, so that was fine because you were getting everything in the same shot. But was that difficult to do as many sunset dialogue takes as what you had?
Yeah, I mean, we were running, we were moving very quickly when it was happening, but I think it really helped the energy with the actors, you know. I think especially, you know, when they're on Point Doom, you know, Cole's out there, she had just now started to remember things and she was there. And so she felt a sense of urgency of, you know, I need to remember this now. I remembered a little bit. I really want to remember more of it. I'm here now. And so seeing that same urgency and then seeing my urgency of getting the shots before the sun goes down, I think all fed, you know, into each other.
I'm a geeky card player, so I like that they're playing poker at the party, and I might have heard this wrong, but I just have to ask this question. They talk about a card waterfall on top of a bottle. What was that about? Because, like, did I hear that wrong, or what were they doing with that?
There were plenty of moments where I let them improv, right? And I don't know what a waterfall is. They started playing cards, and I was like, "What is this? What is this game?" But they all knew it and seemed very invested. And I said,
I was so curious because I
Yeah.
love strange card things. Absolutely love it.
Yeah.
Editing is the last stage of storytelling. What were the lessons about your film that you learned during your edit?
It was a balance, you know. I think everybody knows that, thinks that in the edit, and there was a little bit more shot there. So it was about trusting, you know, the editors. I had a couple working with me at different times. And then this guy named Ryan Purvis, who was helping to consult and help with a lot of the flashback sequences. And the editors did a great job, both of them, of pointing me in the right direction, especially on how much information we needed in the first act. There were, you know, her best friend Hannah has a British accent, and she is from London. And she, you know, I cast her, she's amazing. And there was like a whole sequence in the beginning explaining her accent, right? So it was like, it's not necessarily kill your darlings, but the editors did a great job of like, okay, let's get to the good stuff, right? Like let's really get the movie going along. So they're invaluable for that.
What was a deleted scene that you still think about that, like, you know, it took a little while to cut because you were holding on to it, but you felt better once you did?
I mean, for sure, the party sequence, you know, but also like it feels cool to me now to see this like big for this movie kind of set piece of like her pulling up to a garage and there's a party in there. And it seems like a lot of work for a scene that you only see in the background. In a way, it almost opens the movie up a little bit more. It feels like, okay, this is they can just throw away this party scene that you never actually see anything inside of it. But, you know, we spent quite a bit of time in the scene, establishing who Josh was, establishing his birthday party, learning who Simon was. All the scenes that we wrote and executed to establish the characters that we shot were all thrown out the window. And I think that's probably pretty rare to say that, you know, all the establishing, you know, setups of all the characters were all gone.
That's interesting that you shot that much and that you're able to let it go, especially considering the time it took, you know, in your short production schedule.
Yeah.
You know, I'm curious about like the effects of the flashbacks, because some of them seemed like they were in camera, maybe, and then some of them seemed like they were special effects. What could you tell us about those effects?
Yeah, there was a little bit of both. Sometimes I'd pull the lens off of the camera a little bit to get a flare. A lot of the flares were added. The slow motion I like in camera, so a lot of the slow motion stuff we shot in camera. And then, and Ryan really helped guide a lot of the ramping of the sequences to really like make it look slick.
What was your toughest scene? What was your toughest scene as a writer and as a director? The one that you had to, on the page, come back to over and over, and how did you crack it? And then your toughest scene to shoot as a director?
I think the sequence at the end was tough. I think us believing that she loved Warren or really like wanted to go back to Warren is hard, because the flashback sequence at the end had to establish their relationship, and you'd have to understand why they broke up. So trying to get it to the point where it's like you're watching a couple go through a breakup, which is not great and fun, and then at the end of it you believe that they love each other. That was difficult. That was difficult for sure. And then anything that had to do with the sequence where that she learned that she was drugged and how she got raped and all that kind of stuff. It was hard technically. It was hard, emotionally. We just wanted to make sure that we handled that all properly, and make sure it makes sense too. Like, does this all line up? Is this how this could or would happen?
Well, so what's next? What are you working on next?
If I told you what I was working on, it wouldn't happen. I've learned that lesson.
Don't jinx yourself.
Yeah. No, I mean, there's a couple cool like TV kind of things that have NDAs on it. And then I always have like there's always something jumbling around in my notepad that hopefully I'll find an opportunity to do it. It's usually after the end of like a longer job, I'll see it a hole and say, okay, now I'm going to really, take this one and make it a screenplay.
That's great. Well, I hope you do. Well, you've been very generous with your time. Thanks for hanging out. And I can't wait to see what you do next.
Cool. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, man. Thanks. And that's how the Q&A went down. Special thanks again to writer-director Brian Cavallaro for coming down to chat about his latest film, 32 Weeks. And you could see this film. You could go watch it, folks. So go support independent cinema. Go see what Brian did on his own, and know that you could do the same thing. If you get your ducks in a row the way Brian did, get yourself a skeleton crew, make the dream that you want to make come to life. And of course, support independent film. Go see it. And while you're surfing around looking for things to do online, I also hope you will check out Backstory Magazine over at backstory.net. You can read us on a desktop, laptop, or of course through our iPad app, Backstory. And if you've never read us before, test drive us. Read our free issue. It's packed with amazing material. And we are now releasing our new issue 42, and it's going to have so many cool things in it. We've been waiting so long to release it. The time is right. Everything fell into place. And I'm gonna keep talking about it for a while, because there's so many great things. As a subscriber, you will also get access to our archive, which you could read. It goes back about 1.5 to 2 years now, and we're going to continue to add older issues to our archive. It's just a tedious thing to do. And what can I say, folks? Your support means everything to us. You could use coupon code SAVE5 to save $5 off a subscription over at backstory.net, and your Backstory credentials will also be able to get you to log in to an iPad. So you'll still be able to read it, but you have to use that coupon code over at Backstory. And it's the holiday season, so you could also give a gift subscription. You could do that year round, actually, but a gift subscription of Backstory Magazine to the storyteller in your life. So thanks for supporting my passion project. It really means a lot to me, and also to all the staff over at Backstory Magazine as well. The Q&A with Jeff Goldsmith podcast is a copyright of Unlikely Films Incorporated in 2020. All rights reserved. Folks, if you want to reach out to me on social media or see what I'm doing, you can follow me as Yo Goldsmith on Twitter, Yo Goldsmith on Instagram, although I don't use it a lot. I'm getting into it more. You could also follow Backstory Magazine as Backstory_mag on Twitter and Backstory_mag on Instagram. And we will be actually tweeting out and putting on Instagram art from our magazine through the Backstory account as well, to just because we spend a lot of time and money on our art direction, and it's really kind of amazing. So I've realized that sharing like our splash page of the beginning of each article is a cool way to do that. So you can check us out there. I have a Facebook fan page. I got to keep remembering to check it, but people do write through Facebook. I'm just not on Facebook that much. I'm on Twitter and Instagram more. So you could always reach out there. You could reach out yogoldsmith@gmail.com. That's another way to reach us, of course. And look, it would be great to hear from you. Your support is always welcome. Your ideas are always welcomed. And as you know, I'm Jeff Goldsmith, the publisher of Backstory Magazine and the host of the Q&A, thanking you for tuning in and telling you to stay out of trouble. Till next week.